Welcome, everybody, and thank you for tuning in. Today we're going to be viewing a presentation by Roland Angle. He's an AE 9/11 Truth board member. He'll be talking about some of his credentials and his past work history. At the beginning of our presentation, the name of the presentation is a critique of the NIST World Trade Center building failure reports and the progressive collapse theory. Now, we're still putting together some of our technical issues here right now, so we just want to thank you for tuning in early, and we're honored right now to be joined by Richard Gage, AIA, who is currently in Europe, and he's going to be talking a little bit, giving us an update in these first few minutes as we get ready on what's going on there as he brings the World Trade Center evidence to the people who need to hear it the most in the European countries that he's been visiting. So welcome, Richard, welcome to the presentation.
Thanks so much, Andy. It's exciting to be here with you and with Roland Angle, our board member, who will be providing this model critique of the NIST World Trade Center building failure reports and the progressive collapse theory, that he will be training about 30 other engineers who have already volunteered to take this message to local American Society of Civil Engineering chapters so we can educate the profession from the engineering side, because this is the year of the architect. While Roland is preparing, I did want to update people because we have been on a whirlwind tour through Europe, and I'm here in London right now, having given a presentation here to well over 100 people, and we had no one believing the official story of the collapse of the World Trade Center Twin Towers or Building 7 afterwards. Prior to that, I was in Zurich, same thing, 200 people there. No one after the presentation believed the official story. All wanted an investigation. We also had the opportunity to speak at the University of Zurich, where Daniel Ganser also joined me there, and structural engineer York. What was York's last name again, Andy? Do you recall?
No, sorry.
Van Helleren, something like that. No, that was different. But we have 50 academics in the room in Zurich. It was awesome. And again, the show of hands was overwhelming. I don't know why we're getting such great results in Europe, but we were in Brussels the day before that giving a presentation. Because the title of this whirlwind tour is 9/11 Justice, Every Nation, Every Citizen. And that's what we were bringing to them. We had a press conference in Brussels, and we also had a radio interview there as well on the local community station. And prior to that, which is what brought us to Europe in the first place, was the Amsterdam or Utrecht, the city of Utrecht in the Netherlands near Amsterdam. We had in Utrecht, we had 200 people come to see the 9/11 Truth Conference that was given by George Van Hoots, actually a comedian who's been packing audiences across the Netherlands in 60 presentations, where he talks about the World Trade Center Twin Towers, Building 7. It's all about 9/11 truth. The planes, the Pentagon, he just goes through the whole thing. So he wanted to have a special 9/11 Truth Conference before his presentation last Sunday, and it was extraordinary. Myself and Barbara Honegger were there, and of course Barbara Honegger representing the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry gave an extraordinary overview of the path to justice through the submittal of the grand jury petition to the New York State Attorney or U.S. Attorney General in New York, Lower Manhattan District. So very exciting opportunities, Andy and Roland. I'll be coming home in a couple of days, and we'll be back at the grind trying to wake up the public, the media, and our government officials to the truth about 9/11.
That's right. And by the way, the name is Schroeder. So we've got that. We're also getting the thumbs up. We are ready to go. So without any further ado, we're going to turn the microphone over to Roland Angle, who's going to be giving us a very informative presentation. So Roland, you have the floor.
Thank you, Andy and Richard, and thank you for having me on. As you have noted, my name is Roland Angle. I'm a registered civil engineer in California and have been for the past 50 years. And I'm sitting on the board of directors for AE 911 Truth. And as our viewers know, we've been advocating for a new investigation into the collapse of all three high-rise buildings that occurred on 9/11/2001. Now, this presentation today is tailored to the engineering community. And we have time constraints, of course, so we'll have to move quickly through some information which is technical in part. But everything that we are presenting will be available to the public and to anyone who is interested afterwards through our PowerPoint presentation, and the information is listed at the end. The issue of the failure of these buildings was a political event. It was a shocking crime of mass murder, and it caused us to question our national security. So accusations and counter-accusations surrounding the circumstances of the event arose immediately, and they continue until this day. We in the engineering profession were thrust into the middle of the controversy because we're the experts in the design and construction of commercial structures and bear responsibility for the safety of people using them. Project Due Diligence, which we are launching, is our effort to strip away the political aspects of this event and look at the scientific facts to be gleaned from the evidence. Our aim is to determine one thing and one thing only. Did the buildings fail for the reasons given to us by the official reports? We're going to focus only on that question. We have a professional duty and legal obligation to the public, and we're making every effort to be true to those responsibilities. Now, people know that by this time that Architects and Engineers, founded by Richard Gage in 2006, has been the leading organization in pursuit of forensic research into this massive engineering catastrophe. And I want to note that the information that you hear today has been collected by literally thousands of persons inside and outside the field of engineering, who've donated their time, their money, and their expertise in order to determine the truth of what happened that day. So many people have contributed to this effort that it would be impossible to name all of them, and I don't want to leave anyone out. But please realize that the distillation of evidence you will see today is due to thousands of hours of work performed mostly by volunteers and guided by the AE 911 Truth staff. We're going to focus our analysis on three government reports on the World Trade Center building failures. The first was the work of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. The second and third were the work of the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, NIST, a branch of the U.S. Department of Commerce. And in addition, because the NIST report on the Twin Towers relied on a progressive collapse theory published by the American Society of Civil Engineers, ASCE, we'll analyze the ASCE theory as well. The FEMA issued their preliminary report on the three building failures in 2002. And FEMA's report was used as a foundation by NIST, who conducted its own investigation and issued a report on the collapse of the Twin Towers in 2005 of September of that year, and followed it with another report on the collapse of Building 7 in November of 2008. And the leadership of the American Society of Civil Engineers played a crucial role by participating in the investigations and contributing to the reports. And in addition, the ASCE published the theoretical analysis that's still accepted as a scientific basis for why the Twin Towers collapsed. As you'll see at the conclusion, we're urging the ASCE and all civil and structural engineering organizations to join us in calling for a new investigation into the failure of the three buildings. We base our decision to take this action on what we believe are critical errors in the NIST reports and the ASCE progressive collapse theory, errors which invalidate the NIST conclusions and the ASCE theoretical foundation. So what we're going to have here is a 40-minute examination of the Building 7 report, and then we'll go into the Twin Towers for about another 40 minutes. Then we'll summarize our conclusions and review the reasons we're calling for an investigation, and that will end the presentation today. So this is a critique of the NIST World Trade Center building failure and the progressive collapse theory, and it is the beginning of our project Due Diligence, which is an outreach to the engineering community. We're asking the questions: have the 3 World Trade Center building failures on September 11, 2001 been adequately explained, or is it time for another look? As I've just mentioned, there were 3 official reports on the building failures: the FEMA report in 2002 and the 2 reports by NIST in 2005 and 2008. In addition, there were 3 privately funded reports on the Building 7 failure alone. 2 of those were done as a result of a lawsuit that was brought by Con Edison and their insurance company against World Trade Center properties. One was done by the Arup Group, and they did their report for the plaintiffs in that lawsuit. Weidlinger Associates performed a report for the defendants in that study. In addition, we, AE 911 Truth, funded a study of the Building 7 collapse, and that was performed by the University of Alaska Fairbanks Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering under Professor Leroy Halsey. He's issued a preliminary progress report in September of last year, and the final report is due out later this year. Starting with Building 7, it was the 3rd high-rise to collapse that day, about 350 feet north of the North Tower. It was a 47-story building. Each floor had about an acre of area. It was shaped like a trapezoid. Gross floor area about 2 million square feet, and it was built through and over the existing 2-story tall Con Edison substation, a very unusual arrangement. The floor plan looked like this. It contained 82 columns, 58 on the perimeter, 24 in the central core. And we're going to be focusing on the northeast corner of that building because that is where NIST says that the collapse was initiated due to the failure of a girder that ran between column 44 and column 79. So in our next photo, we're going to be standing at the northeast corner of the building, looking west down the length of that building. What we see overhead running across from right to left is the girder itself that was supposedly failed, and the beams that framed into it from the east were the cause of that failure by heating and expanding due to the office fires. The foundation caissons went right through the Con Edison substation, and this is an example of what the construction looked like during the construction phase. As to the failure itself, it occurred approximately 7 hours after the fall of the Twin Towers at 5:40 in the afternoon. It was a 610-foot tall steel frame building. It wasn't hit by a plane, but it collapsed and turned into a 5-story rubble pile in about 7 seconds. We're going to watch that collapse here on video.
For the 3rd time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Did they actually use the word brought down, and who was it that was telling you this?
The fire department, and they did use the word, we're going to have to bring it down.
We heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. It looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out. About a second later, the bottom floor caves out. The building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground.
And I turned in time to see what looked like a skyscraper implosion. Looked like it had been done by a demolition crew. The whole thing just collapsing down on itself.
It was almost as if it were a planned implosion. It just pancaked.
Building 7 was about 350 feet away from the North Tower, and it was hit by a small amount of debris from the North Tower when it had collapsed earlier in the day. FEMA mapped that debris pattern, and we can see from their map that light debris hit the south face of Building 7 as a result of that North Tower collapse. Before and after, you can see some of the debris. Notice that the glass that was on the walkway, ran over the street, is still mostly intact. There was a fire, a series of fires in the building after the World Trade Center towers collapsed, and we can see the smoke from those fires and some of the damage to the west wall here. NIST mapped the damage to the building and indicated that there was 2 primary zones of damage in the lower left-hand corner in the lower floors and near the top, more toward the center of the building. But they came to the conclusion that the debris damage did not affect the collapse of the building. There was diesel fuel in several small tanks in the building. FEMA thought that there might have had a probability of them igniting the fires. NIST agreed that that was a low probability, and most of the fuel was recovered from the main tanks in a vault below ground afterwards. And firefighters testified they neither saw nor smelled diesel fuel fires. So diesel fuel as a cause of the fires was eliminated. NIST noted that there were fires on floors 7, 8, 9, 11, 12, 13, 19, 22, 29, and 30 at some point during that day, and that the fires on the upper 4 floors were not active about 1:30 p.m. Keep in mind the building came down at 5:20. The NIST collapse theory for the building looks like this. They said that fires on the 12th floor heated the beams in the northeast corner of the building on the 13th floor, and those beams expanded or sagged and pulled that girder or pushed it off of its seat at column 79 on the 13th floor. That caused the girder to fall off its seat and impact the next floor down on the 12th floor, and that caused a cascade 8 floors down to the 5th floor, as a result leaving column 79 unsupported laterally so that it buckled, which then spread north to south and east to west, causing the entire central core columns of the building to progressively collapse and ultimately cause the entire exterior to buckle due to the lack of lateral support for those columns. So that is the NIST collapse theory, how it was initiated, how it progressed, and how it ended. They said that the reason for the collapse was entirely due to office fires. This is a photo that was taken about 90 minutes before the building collapsed, and we can see, looking at the 12th floor, that the fires have progressed from the northeast to the northwest and are burning all the way over in the area of column 52 and 53. The fires burn out after about 20 to 30 minutes in any one location because they run out of fuel. So the fires on the 12th floor must have been out for a good period of time before the building collapsed. Here's the erroneous assumptions, the errors, the omissions, and the other issues with the Building 7 report that we're going to discuss. The girder bearing seat at column 79 for that girder, according to NIST, was only 11 inches wide. They also said there were no stiffeners on that girder at the column, and that the thermally expanded girder could move past the column 79 side plates, that there were no shear studs on the girder, that the west and south girder connections to column 79 were broken all the way down to the 6th floor, that the northeast corner floor failure cascaded down 8 floors, that there was no lateral support beams framing into beam G3005, that they notched their beams and girders to simulate their buckling due to fire in their model. There is evidence of high temperature enough to melt steel documented by FEMA that was ignored by NIST. And the NIST model shows radical deformation of the upper exterior as the east side interior collapses, but that is not observed in the actual video footage of the collapse. That there was a simultaneously free fall of all 4 corners of the roof line, and NIST did not investigate the implications of that. And they refused to respond to legitimate inquiries. So then we'll summarize that before we go on to the Twin Towers. Looking at the seat for the girder at column 79, the NIST report says that the girder was considered to have lost vertical support when its web was no longer supported by the bearing seat. The bearing seat at column 79 was 11 inches wide. Thus, when the girder end at column 79 had been pushed laterally at least 5.5 inches, it was no longer supported by the bearing seat. That would cause the flange of the girder to curl up and the girder to fall. However, when we looked at the drawings for that particular detail, we find that the girder bearing seat was actually 12 inches wide. NIST later admitted that. That would mean that according to their theory, the girder would have to be pushed at least 6 inches before it could be subject to failure. So that's one problem. We'll stop and take a look at what happens when the beams are heated and the girder's heated and the column is heated and what they were heated to. The NIST report claimed that the beams were heated to 600 degrees centigrade, the girders were heated to 500 degrees centigrade, and the column was heated to 300 degrees centigrade in the area around column 79. So looking at what those temperatures mean to the structural steel, for the beams, we see in the graph on the left that the strength of that beam would have been reduced by about 50%. The girders heated to 500 degrees centigrade would have lost about 20% of their strength, and the columns heated to 300 degrees would not have lost any of their strength. Looking at their stiffness, we see that the beams at 600 degrees have lost 70% of their stiffness. The girders at 500 degrees have lost 40% of their stiffness, and the columns at 300 degrees have lost 20% of their stiffness. So we take those temperatures as gospel, and we use those same temperatures in our analyses that we ran in the Building 7 report at the University of Alaska. This is a spreadsheet that shows the effect of the temperature on a 52-foot long beam and how much it would expand and then contract due to sagging. At 600 degrees, which is the top yellow band, if we look under the net horizontal expansion, we see that at 600 degrees, it is 5.39 inches. That is as far as that could expand under a temperature of 600 degrees. So that being less than 6 inches shows that it could not have pushed the girder far enough to get the web off of the edge of the beam seat. Going down to the second band, we're seeing the maximum net horizontal expansion that the beam could experience was at 654 degrees, and that maximum expansion is only 5.72 inches. So even after that, the sagging takes over and it gets shorter. So the beam could never expand more than 5.72 inches. It couldn't push it 6 inches. The web could never get past the edge of the beam seat. Looking at the girder itself, the NIST representation is shown at the top, and the actual drawing of the girder connection is shown at the bottom in Frankel drawing 9114. And it shows that there was a plate that was welded on either side of the web and to the lower flange to stiffen the end of the girder. NIST left those stiffeners off. Well, those stiffeners would have an effect upon the section modulus of the flange, and even if we move the web past the edge of the beam seat, the flange could not curl up now because it's been strengthened by that stiffener. This is a pictorial view showing the stiffeners. The NIST representation shows no stiffeners. They simply left the stiffeners off. Photograph shows that, in fact, the stiffeners were installed at the end of the girder. So we go to Professor Halsey's finite element modeling of the building. This is the 12th and 13th floor of his abacus model, heated to the temperatures used in the NIST report. A view of his northeast corner of that floor. And his finite element analysis showed that with the girder web stiffeners included, the web could be beyond the bearing seat with no flange failure occurring due to the partial height stiffener, which made the flange much more robust in bending. So the omission of those stiffener plates introduced a critical error in the NIST model. NIST eventually admitted leaving the stiffeners out in a letter to one of our researchers, David Cole, and they said that the web stiffeners shown at the end of the girder prevent web crippling, and the structural analysis did not show any web crippling failures. Therefore, the web crippling plates did not need to be included in the models or the analysis. That was a letter signed by a person in their public relations department, and no engineer signed off on that allegation, which is a patently absurd conclusion. Then there's the question of side plates. Side plates were welded to column 79 at the floors, and they extended 1.8 inches past the column flange. Now that's important because when you heat the beams and the girder and the column, the girder expands, and as it's pushed by the beam, it's trapped behind the side plates. It can't get past the side plates because it's jammed right up against the column. NIST apparently didn't consider the side plate interference at all. Never mentions it, never discusses it. So that's an omission that, again, has critical implications, because if the girder can't move past the side plates, it can't get off the seat, and it can't fall, and it can't fail. And their collapse initiation theory is worthless. They also claim that there were no shear studs on the girders. The final version of the revised drawing shows that there were 30 shear studs on that girder. So here we have another omission. Why is that important? Well, NIST calculated the force required to shear one of those studs, and it turns out to be about, they show it here on the left, and you look down, you see it's about 19.5 kips. Using that shear force required to breach each of those shear studs on the girder would require a total of 585 kips to be applied by the 5 beams pushing from the east, pushing on the girder. That's about 117 kips for each beam. The problem with that is that the beam itself can only withstand an axial force of about 21 kips before it begins to buckle. And if you heat the beam to 600 degrees centigrade, like they said it was heated, the modulus of elasticity is reduced, and then you can only get a total force of about 7 kips per beam. So there's nowhere near the lateral force on that girder as required by NIST due to the fact that those shear studs on the girder could not be broken. Now, they claim that the thermally induced falling of the girder caused a floor cascade and broken girder connections all the way down to the 5th floor. The 13th floor fell on the 12th floor. Then there was a cascade of those floors onto the 11th, et cetera, down to floor number 5. And that left column 79 with no lateral support for 9 floors. And it buckled as a result. And that started the collapse of the whole building. But there's a problem. Their connection damage information in their same report doesn't agree with the diagram shown here, because it shows no damage to the girders on the south and west faces of that column on floors 8, 9, and 13. We see their diagrams here. This is floor 8. Up above, you see the connections in the horizontal direction, and down below, the connections in the vertical direction. The yellow dots at column 79 coming in from the west and the south indicate that there was no damage to those connections. The same thing on floor 9. No connection damage, framing into that column from the south and the west. Same on the 13th floor. This is the NIST report. So what that means, we know that a column requires lateral support from 2 orthogonal directions to resist buckling. And due to its moment of inertia, column 79 could span at least 5 stories with no lateral support without buckling. But the NIST floor connection damage shows that column 79 never had less than 2 orthogonal girders laterally supporting it for more than 3 stories. So their buckling theory for column 79 is not possible. But furthermore, even if we allow the girder to fall, the floor will hinge down from the north and the east and impact the girder below near column 79 on the 12th floor. Now, we can calculate the force required to shear the wells to the column of the 14-inch support plate underneath the girder bearing seat, and that turns out to be 632,000 pounds. That's a very straightforward calculation. You're going to have to hit that connection with 632,000 pounds to break it loose and initiate the cascade on down below. So we did a modal analysis of that section of the corner of the building, and the natural frequency of that section of the floor turns out to be about 0.52 hertz. We know that the concrete wouldn't fall with the beams and the girders because of the shear studs being broken and the welded wire fabric installed in the concrete and the shear studs in the exterior girders being intact. So that's the way that thing is going to fall down. Knowing the natural frequency, once we have that, we can figure the stiffness of the system, and it turns out to be about 6,600 pounds per inch. Once we have the stiffness, we can use it in the impact calculation and get find the combined stiffness of the system, the 12th floor and the 13th floor together. Now, the stiffness of the lower floor is very stiff because, of course, it's still attached to the floor and the columns. That turns out to have a stiffness of about over 7.5 million pounds per inch. That was what Arup calculated, and we agree with that. So you get the combined stiffness using the reciprocal rule, and it hasn't changed much. It's only still something over 6,600 pounds per inch. So Arup analysis used a potential energy at impact of 3,473,000 inch-pounds, and we verified that. It's good. And you can use the standard equation to find the deflection of the girder and beam assembly, and that turns out to be a little over 32 inches. Using a standard equation to find the force from that, the force turns out to be 215,144 pounds, but we've already noted that you need 632,000 pounds to break that shear and cause that 12th floor to break loose. And in addition, the above calculations were done at room temperature, and if you heat the girders to 500 degrees centigrade and reduce the modulus of elasticity accordingly, you get a reduced stiffness, and that turns out to be about 4,000 pounds per inch, and recalculating that with a reduced stiffness gives you a force, a deflection of about 41 inches and a force of about 166,680 pounds. So that's only about 1/4 of the 632,000 pounds that you need. So there's no way that that falling assembly of the 13th floor onto the 12th floor could break loose that connection at column 79 on the 12th floor and initiate the cascade. Then there's the question of the support beams into column G3005. Now, G3005 was the beam that was northernmost beam at the floor, and when it was built, they put in lateral support beams from the exterior beam into that beam from the north, short stiffener beams. NIST left those off. Another omission. Without those support beams, that beam will buckle when it's heated. The UAF analysis confirmed that. NIST said that. We agree. Problem is that the lateral support beams really are there, and when you put them in, that beam doesn't buckle. So that, again, is going to change the behavior of the system and the conclusions that you can come to from it. NIST went on and showed that they were going to notch the beams and girders throughout the floor system in a manner that would cause the beams and girders to act as tension members, so that when the interior columns collapsed, they would pull the exterior columns in and spread the collapse mechanism. But you can't just come along and arbitrarily notch those beams and girders like that. That would indicate that this mechanism would occur simultaneously in all these beams and girders, and that's not going to happen in reality, because any weakness in those beams and girders would have been caused by the fires, and the fires acted in different areas at different times, and they would not act in the uniform manner that NIST indicated they would. That is a device that NIST used to make their collapse initiation and progression model work. It's not allowed. Then there's the question of excessive temperatures. There was only one piece of metal that was saved from World Trade Center 7 for analysis. That one piece, however, showed high temperatures, and unusual erosion patterns. That was examined. FEMA examined it, said there were microstructural changes and severe erosion and evidence of high temperature attack on the steel, including oxidation and sulfidation with subsequent intergranular melting. And that was readily visible in the near surface microstructure. They said that a liquid eutectic mixture containing primarily iron, oxygen, and sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel, and the temperature that that steel experienced approached 1,000 degrees centigrade, which is substantially lower than what would be expected for melting the steel. Well, that's two things there. First of all, office fires don't produce temperatures of 1,000 degrees centigrade. So that's a problem. Secondly, if the steel is melting at 1,000 degrees centigrade, normally it doesn't do that till much higher, like 1,700 centigrade. So it would only melt at that temperature if there was a presence of a eutectic incendiary, such as thermate, which contains sulfur. That would explain the presence of the sulfur. NIST completely ignored all this evidence. No discussion of it whatsoever in their report anywhere. The USGS took a photo from the sky 5 days afterwards, and that showed this infrared photograph shows temperatures in the basement areas of all three buildings that were 627 degrees centigrade up to 747 degrees centigrade. And there were official reports by firemen and others of molten metal in the basement areas of all three buildings. Again, the official report by NIST and FEMA and the 9/11 Commission omit any mention of that molten metal or make any attempt to explain those high temperatures. Again, not possible with office fires. Videos of the actual collapse of the building show that the NIST model doesn't replicate the observed behavior of the building. Real collapse doesn't have the exterior deformation at the top of the building seen in the NIST model, and the NIST model stops early, which fails to show how the entire collapse would actually have occurred. So, we'll look at that collapse now. Compare the actual with the model. You see in the NIST model, their collapse starts on the 13th floor. There's a collapse down to the 5th floor. The column becomes unsupported, and the instability then spreads throughout the building from north to south and east to west. However, that causes a deformation of the building because the collapse mechanism can't work quickly enough to make it happen all at once. Doesn't look anything like the way the building itself looks coming down right into its own footprint without significant deformation. NIST stopped its simulation several seconds into its process, and that raises a question of why that happened. Here's a graphic from their report that shows what the building looked like further into its collapse mechanism, and we can see why they stopped the graphic animation, because the top of the building has twisted around more than 90 degrees normal to the face of the building, and it is rapidly assuming a very distorted appearance. This is the model without debris damage, and they didn't show what it would look like with the debris damage, the debris from the North Tower. Then there's the question of free fall acceleration. Physics teacher David Chandler proved the entire roof line of the building was in full free fall acceleration for about 2.5 seconds, which would be about an 8-story fall. That occurred near the beginning of the collapse. And NIST was confronted with this fact in their preliminary draft report on the building, and they admitted it in their final report, but they didn't address the implications of free fall, and they didn't change their model or their conclusion. Here's a graph of the roof line of the building, the velocity versus the time, and we see about 3/4 of a second into the collapse, it went into free fall, and that continued until about 3¼ seconds into the mechanism. So you had more than 2 seconds, much more than 2 seconds of free fall. The columns were supposed to be buckling in the building, and a column buckling always has some residual resistance even after it's fully buckled. We see the graph showing the deflection of the building, of the column, compared to its full height. And we see that there's minimum resistance and it decays until the ratio reaches about 0.5, and then it levels out, never gets it to be any less than that. That means that because of that resistance, free fall acceleration isn't possible when columns are buckling. In free fall, an object's potential energy is converted to kinetic energy, and it can't be doing any other work. So the free-falling upper section C of the building could not have been crushing the lower portions B and A of the building or itself, because it appears that section B is not providing any resistance at all. The NIST model never accelerates at more than 60% of free fall, and it can't explain the free fall episode in this collapse. Their model cannot explain the measured evidence. So all the assumptions listed below, which were used in their report, have been shown to be erroneous, and the correction of these assumptions invalidate the report's conclusion. The girder bearing seat was 12 inches, not 11 inches. Stiffeners would have prevented the flange from folding, eliminated the chance of a girder walk-off. The thermally expanded girder couldn't move past the column side plates. There were shear studs on the girder that would cause the beams to buckle before pushing the girder off its seat. All the west and south girder connections to column 79 were not broken down to the 6th floor. The northeast corner floor failure could not cascade down 8 floors because there's not enough energy to break through the girder connection on the next floor down. There were lateral support beams on beam G3005. They would have prevented it from buckling. The beam and girder notching that NIST used to simulate their buckling due to fire in the model is not consistent with the time-phased weakening that fire would produce. The evidence of temperatures high enough to melt steel documented by FEMA was ignored. And the NIST model shows radical deformation of the upper exterior as the east side interior collapses, but that's not observed in the actual video footage of the collapse. And finally, a simultaneous free fall of all 4 corners of the roof line does have implications. NIST refused to respond to legitimate inquiry regarding these matters. For instance, here we have 2 letters written by engineers asking them to provide calculations and analysis substantiating the girder walk-off and the impact force required through the next floor down. However, the NIST director refused to provide that information and claimed that it might jeopardize public safety. We believe this is probably the first time in history that the laws of physics have been claimed to be a threat to public safety. Summarizing their reports, problems with the Building 7 report: the seat 12 inches wide, not 11 inches wide, prevents the failure of the beam of the girder. Stiffener plates prevent the failure of the flange of the girder. Side plates on the column prevent the girder from walking off the girder seat. The shear studs cause the girder to act as integral body with a concrete slab and prevent the 13th floor from collapsing. Column 79 wasn't laterally unsupported for 9 floors, according to NIST's own information. They omitted the lateral support beams for beam G3005. They would have prevented it from buckling that NIST claimed occurred. They miscalculated the magnitude of the load imposed on the girder on the 12th floor, caused by the collapse of the girder on the 13th floor. Couldn't break the welds. 12th floor wouldn't collapse. They imposed unrealistic artificial fire damage symmetrically to floor beams and girders in the building in order to get their computer finite element model collapse sequence to work. They omitted the information contained in the FEMA report, Appendix C, of the salvaged beam in World Trade Center structural steel that exhibited evidence of intergranular melting, and they give no explanation for this omission. Their computer model doesn't replicate the actual collapse. It deforms significantly more than what is observed, and in addition, it stops shortly into the collapse sequence. They acknowledged free fall for 2¼ seconds, and that violates their fire-induced theory of collapse initiation. Asymmetric fire damage couldn't result in symmetric simultaneous loss of support in 82 columns. And they refused to release relevant input data for critical calculations of their collapse models, stating that the release of the information could jeopardize public safety. Now we're going to move on to the Twin Towers. The items we're going to discuss are these: the background of the buildings, the aircraft impacts and damage, the NIST column failure theory and the collapse hypothesis, the evidence that the core columns failed first, the ASCE published progressive collapse theory and an analysis of that theory, the South Tower collapse symmetry anomaly, other high-rise fires, destruction of the evidence, a summary of their problems with the tower reports, and then the deficiency categories in their reports and the ASCE published theory. The Twin Towers were a departure from high-rise tradition. Earlier designs had continuous grids of steel or concrete columns and beams throughout the building. But the Twin Towers were built as a tube structure. They had a dense mesh of welded and bolted steel placed on the perimeter. That gave them more efficient lateral load resistance. And then there was an internal core, a dense grid of 47 large welded steel columns connected by bolted horizontal beams at every floor. And the core and perimeter columns split the gravity loads. Prefabricated floor assemblies were welded and bolted to the beams at the core and the perimeter, and these assemblies were made up of double 29-inch deep trusses every 80 inches with 24-inch deep bridging trusses running normal to them at 13-foot intervals. And that was all topped by an 1.5 inch deep corrugated steel floor pan and the concrete with reinforced steel was poured on top of that to a depth of 4 inches. These structural innovations allowed for an open floor plan. The buildings were 207 foot square. They had the central core columns were 135 feet by 87 feet. That allowed for a largest floor span was 60 feet. They were solidly constructed, 47 massive steel core columns, 240 steel perimeter columns, amounting to a 100,000 ton heat sink. Central core columns were tapered in height. They were virtually structural pyramids. They got thinner as they rose up in height, and they transitioned to rolled wide flange columns at the upper floors of the towers. There were 12 different strength steels used at different heights on the perimeter columns of the towers to accommodate the wind load and seismic stresses while keeping the gravity-induced unit stress on both the perimeter and the core columns at each floor the same to eliminate floor warpage. Looking at the plane impacts, the North Tower was hit at 8:46 a.m. that day. It collapsed 102 minutes later. That was American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767-200 extended range aircraft, hitting the building with an estimated impact velocity of 473 miles per hour at the center of the north face between the 93rd and the 99th floors. South Tower was hit at 9:03, 17 minutes later. It collapsed in 56 minutes. That was United Airlines Flight 175, the same type of aircraft, with an estimated impact velocity of 566 miles per hour. It hit off the center toward the east wall, and it was angled in, and that occurred between the 77th and the 85th floor of that building. Looking at the North Tower, we see the aircraft was pitched slightly downward when it hit at about the 95th floor. And everyone agrees, all the evidence shows that the 98th floor is where the collapse initiated. Looking at the north face of the North Tower, we see that the wings were rolled up about 25 to 30 degrees from the horizontal. And again, looking at the 98th floor, it was only impacted by the tip of the wing of the aircraft. This is a discussion about the potential for the collapse due to aircraft with a structural engineer, Charles Thornton, who later turned out to be one of the FEMA investigators.
The fact that they were designed to resist over 13,000 tons of wind pressure meant that they could not be knocked over. In a remarkably prescient interview given over 15 years ago, Charlie Thornton, now one of the investigators, considered the scenario.
Well, 13,000 tons is a lot of force. People always talk about an airplane crashing into a building. And in 1944 or 45, a plane did crash into the Empire State Building. But the largest aircraft flying today, at least commercially, the 747, fully loaded, is on the order of 300 tons. So if you think about a 300-ton element crashing into a building that's been designed to carry 13,000 tons, you can see that an aircraft crashing into the World Trade Center would probably not do anything to the major building. It could affect localized structural elements, could knock out a column, and there could be some damage. But as far as a plane knocking a building over of that type, that would not happen.
Since the Empire State accident had shown that a plane could crash into a New York skyscraper, the designers were forced to consider.
In fact, the designers did consider that. John Skilling, who designed the towers, said that he designed the World Trade center tower to take a hit from a Boeing 707, which was the largest commercial aircraft flying at that time, and is very close in size to the 767s that did hit the building. He said his analysis indicated the biggest problem would be the fact that the fuel would dump into the building, but the building structure would still be there. We're going to see how the buildings compensate for that impact in this video segment here. The robustness of the perimeter frame tube system and the large size of the buildings helped the towers withstand the impact. The structural system redistributed the loads without collapsing in places of the aircraft impact. That's NIST observation. An impact analysis shows that the wings were shredded before they hit the central core. And the diameter of the fuselage is only 16.5 feet compared to the central core at 135 foot wide. The NIST report rendered the views of impact damage to the affected floors of the North Tower for the 94th, 95th, 96th, and 97th floors. We can see that the damage is most severe on the 95th and the 96th floor where the impact of the fuselage occurred. They didn't even render the damage on the 98th floor where the collapse actually started. A pictorial view of the calculated damage to the central core shows that there's little to no damage on the 98th floor. As to the jet fuel, this showed that there was only going to be about 240 gallons of fuel dumped onto the 98th floor. And furthermore, that the amount of fuel spilled only influenced the results of the first few minutes anywhere. The long-term behavior of the simulated fires was unaffected by the fuel. These are the reasons why the aircraft impact and the jet fuel couldn't have caused collapse. The wings wouldn't have made it to the central core. Most of the jet fuel was aerosolized on impact. Most of it remained outside of the building. Fuel which did enter the building burned up within a few minutes. The redundant steel frame redistributed the loads. And the factor of safety against vertical collapse for the perimeter columns was 5-to-1 and the central core was 3-to-1. So this is far too high for the impact damage to approximately 20% of the columns to have caused collapse. Now, NIST theorized that the exterior columns failed because fires heated the floor trusses, which in turn sagged, causing them to buckle and pull the exterior columns in, and that's what started the whole global collapse. They said that this happened on the south face of the North Tower and the east face of the South Tower. Looking at their detailed truss model, when they heated it, you see that once it gets up to about 560 degrees, the web members collapse, and that causes the sagging, which they say pulled on the exterior columns with a force of between 9 and 14 kips. However, when we look at this graph, we see a few problems with it. First of all, as you heat it up from 0 degrees, when it gets to about 450 degrees Celsius, it's pushing outward on the exterior perimeter columns with a force of about 80 kips. Now, there's no video evidence or pictorial evidence at all that indicates that the perimeter columns were bulging outward, which they would have had to have been if they were being subjected to forces of 80 kips pushing outward. Instead, when it gets to about 560 degrees, the web members collapse and the floor truss begins to sag, and then they say it pulls inward on the columns with a force of 9 to 14 kips. However, their global model couldn't produce an inward force from the sagging floor trusses, which was strong enough to pull the columns inward. 9 to 14 kips didn't cut it. So they applied an artificial 5,000-pound lateral load to all of those connections in the impact zone in order to make the columns buckle. Well, there's no basis for that assumption. You can't just assume loads of that magnitude and put them into your calculations to make your model work. They did that on every single connection in the impact zone. That amounts to a total load of about 750,000 pounds that they applied to that face of the building, which wasn't really there. They did it because they needed to produce the bowing of the columns inward, which they say occurred in this manner. And they said that they measured these photographic evidence, and the maximum bowing would occur at about 55 inches inward. This was supposedly at 10:22 a.m., which is 7 minutes before that building collapsed. So let's look at their explanation for the collapse initiation. With the continually increased bowing, more columns buckled, the entire width of the south wall buckled, starting at the center of the south wall, rapidly progressing toward the sides, and as a result of the buckling of the south wall significantly unloaded and redistributed its load to the softened core through the hat truss and to the east and west walls through the spandrels. 2 minutes before the collapse, the north and west walls at floor 98 carried, the northeast and west walls at the 98th floor carried about 7%, 35%, and 30% more gravity loads than they did right after impact. The south wall carried about 7%, and the core 20% less loads. The section above the impact zone tilted to the south as column instability progressed rapidly from the south wall to the east and west walls. That resulted in increased gravity load on the core columns and the release of potential energy due to the downward movement of the building mass above the buckled columns exceeded the strain energy that could be absorbed by the structure. Global collapse ensued. That's their explanation of how the entire collapse initiation began. Notice that they only say global collapse ensued. They don't investigate at any point in their report how that global collapse progressed from that point forward. The problems with their explanation are these. There's no evidence or basis for the claim that the sagging trusses could pull in the south wall of the north towel. That's why they didn't generate that load, so they applied artificial loads. They said they had to apply the artificial loads to match the photographic evidence. But with a factor of safety of 5, the load increase to the east and west walls of 35% and 30% would only increase the demand on those columns to about 27% of their capacity. So there's no reason to expect them to fail. This simply assumes a horizontal propagation across the building. No evidence that it could occur. They assume global vertical collapse, and then they relied on a paper by Northwestern University professor Zdeněk Bezant as an explanation for the vertical collapse propagation. The video evidence shows that the core columns are what actually collapse first, not the perimeter columns. We'll see evidence of that here. This is the north tower, which had an antenna on top.
When the collapse finally starts, the antenna started just a little bit before the exterior of the building started, And that tells us that the core columns let go first.
If the core columns gave way first, then this collapse initiation theory is wrong. Here we can look at the still photographs taken a 30th of a second apart of the antenna, and we can see that it drops down, up, down, up, down. So the antenna is moving first. That means the core columns had to fail first. FEMA said that the transmission tower on top of the structure began to move downward and laterally slightly before movement was evidenced at the exterior wall. This suggests that the collapse began with one or more failures in the central core area of the building. That's FEMA. The antenna was supported by a hat truss, and the hat truss connected the exterior columns to the core columns. So if the core columns supported the hat truss, what both the video evidence and the FEMA analysis indicate is that the core columns failed first. Then the hat truss and the antenna descended before the perimeter columns. Then the core columns pulled on the floor trusses, and the floor trusses pulled in on the perimeter columns, and that's what initiated the complete collapse. Here's a video of the south tower that shows the inward bowing of the perimeter columns immediately prior to collapse. There's no disputing the fact that the perimeter columns were bowing inward immediately prior to collapse. But that must have been caused by the core column failures, because when the core columns pulled on the floor trusses then had to pull in on the perimeter columns, and that's what initiated the collapse. Would have looked like this. Now we're going to stop and take a look at the progressive collapse theory that was published by the American Society of Civil Engineers in their Journal of Engineering Mechanics, that was submitted to their journal by Professor Zdeněk Bazant of Northwestern University 2 days after the attack. It was published by them in January of the next year in an article titled, "Why Did the World Trade Center Collapse? Simple Analysis." He claimed that a large dynamic load would have occurred, causing what he termed a powerful jolt, and that would overcome the reserve strength of the columns below. But various questions were raised about that theory, and so he came back and defended it in another article, "What Did and Did Not Cause the Collapse of the World Trade Center Twin Towers in New York," published by the JEM in October of 2008. A brief description of his theory is this. He used an energy analysis. He said in a mathematical model that what happened was that the kinetic energy of the upper part of the building, when it fell on the lower part of the building, was greater than the resistance of the buckling columns that failed in the collapse initiation zone, plus the inertial resistance of the structure in the building below the initiation zone, plus the structural resistance of the columns in the building below the initiation zone. In mathematical notation, that would be E1 is greater than E2 plus E3 plus E4, where E1 is the kinetic energy of the upper falling part of the building. E2 is the sum of resistance to buckling of the columns in the initiation zone. E3, the conservation of momentum of the upper story of the lower part being hit by the falling upper part, and E4, the sum of resistance to collapse of columns in the lower part. Newton's third law says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. That means when the upper part of the building fell on the lower part of the building, it was met by an equal force. David Chandler measured the collapse of the building, and it showed that there was a continuous acceleration at about 2/3 of gravity with no deceleration at all. And you need that deceleration caused by the jolt to amplify the load and overcome the resistance of the building below. However, here we see the velocity plotted against the time, and the slope of that line is the acceleration of the roof line, and it is constant at about 6.3 meters per second squared. No jolt. So McQueen and Zambodi published The Missing Jolt, a simple refutation of the NIST Bezant collapse hypothesis on the website Journal of 9/11 Studies in 2009. David Chandler published his destruction of the World Trade Center North Tower and fundamental physics on the website in 2010. Bezant and Lee were forced to come back and defend their theory again in a paper, Why the Observed Motion History of the World Trade Center Towers is Smooth. That was published by the Journal of Engineering Mechanics in January of 2011. Zambodi and John submitted a discussion paper to the JEM in 2011, pointing out the errors in the paper, in Bezant's paper. Took a year, but they were finally notified by the JEM that their discussion paper was rejected because of one reviewer's comments. So they responded to the rejection with a rebuttal, showing that the rejection was unjustified as the reviewer was wrong on almost all points. The JEM editors responded by agreeing to publish the discussion paper after an editorial review. However, another year passed, no action on the part of the JEM editors. Zambodi and John sent a letter to him inquiring about the status of their paper. 3 months later, the chief editors of the JEM responded that the discussion paper was out of scope and wouldn't be published. While the above was occurring, Zambodi and Johns joined with Zudolinsky in writing a full technical note addressing all 4 of the Bezant World Trade Center papers that the JEM had published. It was submitted to the JEM in May of 2012 and was rejected by them after a few months as being, quote, out of scope, with no further explanation. It was then submitted to the International Journal of Protective Structures, where it was published in June 2013. So the ASCE and their journal editors closed off all discussion of this question. The problems with Bezant calculations are these. For E1, he used the maximum design load for the mass of the upper part of the building, but that's not what was there that day. The actual in-service load was considerably less. He used 54 million kilograms. It was actually 33 million kilograms. In addition, he used a velocity after a fall of 1 story due to gravitational acceleration at 8.5 meters per second, but the actual measurement, which you can take off the videos, was only 6.1 meters per second. Now the velocity is squared in the kinetic energy equation, and this doubles that contribution. So due to his nearly doubling the mass and nearly doubling the velocity, E1 was too high by a factor of almost 4. Then the fall through the initiation zone didn't account for the buckling resistance of the columns in that zone, which he eliminated completely, and he reduced E2 to 0. The conservation of momentum calculation, he used only 627,000 kilogram mass for the story below, which is only about 14% of the 3.87 million kilogram mass he used for the stories in his 14-story upper section. So E3 was too low by a factor of about 7. And his estimate of the resistance of the columns in the lower part of the building was only about 31% of what can actually be shown to be, and the E4 was too low by a factor of 3. When you correct these miscalculations, the inequality is reversed. E1 is less than E2 plus E3 plus E4, and the progressive collapse will not occur. When you graph his calculations versus what was actually measured versus what was calculated with a correction of his data, you see his graph is the left. That's Besant's theory, no jolt. The velocity continues to increase. And the actual measured data by Chandler is shown by the dashed lines with margin of error. But when you correct Besant's input data, you see that the downward movement is halted altogether in about 2 seconds, indicating that the building doesn't collapse. If you look at a gravitational collapse theorized by Besant, you would see the top 12 stories, and this is the North Tower again, driving down the lower part of the building. But the destruction of the upper part of the building is already complete well before the building has entirely collapsed. It's missing. FEMA said that the primary debris field is about 1,200 feet in diameter, and much of the material has landed outside the tower's footprint. Here we'll see video of the top 12 stories disintegrating before any collapse occurs in the lower part of the building. Clearly, the upper portion of the building is not crushing the lower part of the building. The destruction of the North Tower shows that the destruction was symmetric for the first several seconds. Notice that the smoke is coming out evenly on the side and the front of the buildings as it collapses, initiated at the 98th floor. In the South Tower, you have a similar thing. Even though the plane hit at an angle, not straight on, even though the top of the building is leaning over, you still have symmetrical destruction of the lower part of the building. You can see it here in this photograph. And you'll see it here as it collapses, coming all the way down symmetrically. How does asymmetric damage cause symmetrical collapse? Flame engulfed steel framed eye rises have never collapsed before. Some examples: 1988 in Los Angeles, 1991 Philadelphia, 2004 Caracas, Venezuela. These buildings were all consumed by widespread fires, much larger and more extensive than what occurred in the Twin Towers. These buildings did not collapse. Destruction of the evidence caused consternation. Bill Manning, the editor of Fire Engineering magazine, demanded a stop to the destruction of the evidence. He said structural steel was cut up and sold for scrap, and that shows an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. Very little effort made to preserve the evidence. It was destroyed with remarkable speed and efficiency. That is a crime. Destruction of evidence at a crime scene is illegal. We had about 400 trucks a day removing all but a few hundred pieces of steel from the crime scene. That effectively scrubbed it. John Gross of NIST was in the salvage yard deciding what material to save. But items like the one in the photo, which shows clear evidence of melting, weren't saved. They only saved between 1/4 and 0.5% of the steel, 236 pieces total from the Twin Towers, and only one small piece from Building 7. Of the steel they did save, the testing showed only 3 pieces that experienced ignored high temperature and molten metal. Summarizing their problems, their claim that the upper part crushed the lower part violates the law of conservation of momentum and the law that for every action between bodies there's an equal and opposite reaction. There's no jolt. They claim the floor trusses pushed outward on the perimeter columns with a force of about 80 kips. There's no evidence of that. They imposed artificial 5-kip forces on each floor to a column connection over the 5 stories in the damage zone on the south face of the North Tower in order to make their collapse initiation model work. That's not acceptable. Can't do that. They didn't investigate or explain the global collapse which occurred, simply saying global collapse ensued. The collapse sequence initiated by the failure of the floor trusses and subsequent pulling into the perimeter columns wasn't strong enough to make that happen. The sequence ignores the fact that the core columns must have failed first. They failed to provide any information suggesting that the load capacity of the core and perimeter columns was exceeded at any time during the collapse sequence. The factor of safety of 3 in the core and 5 in the perimeter columns would have prevented the failure mechanism that's theorized in their collapse initiation model. They depended upon a ASCE published progressive collapse theory by Professor Bazant. His theory has been shown to have erroneous input data, renders it non-viable as an explanation for the observed behavior. Here's the categories of their problems: defective collapse initiation theories for both the Twin Towers and Building 7, unjustified assumption and errors in the Twin Towers and Building 7 reports, omissions and alterations of construction details in the Building 7 report, errors in the calculations of the ASCE published theories, internal contradictions in the Building 7 report, ignoring evidence of high temperature exposure of the structural steel, and refusal to respond to peer criticism. This information presents us with the opportunity to join architects and engineers in a call for a new investigation. Here's what you can do. Sign the petition calling for a new investigation. Disseminate this information to engineering colleagues. Donate to AE 911 Truth to help us reach as many engineers as possible. Urge any engineering organization to which you belong to call for a new investigation and become a volunteer presenter for Project Due Diligence to help us deliver this information to local engineering organizations. What would that investigation look like? This is what we recommend. First of all, our participation, since we've been leading this call for this investigation for the last 12 years. We want a panel composed of civil, structural, fire protection, and mechanical engineers, physicists, chemists, and demolition experts to review the evidence. We want panel members to be vetted to make sure they have no conflict of interest. We want a staff to prepare documents and keep records, subpoena power, adequate funding, a reasonable timeline to investigate and prepare a peer-reviewed report, and a report to be released and broadly disseminated to the public. Any of the information that we have presented here can be found. All the slides are referenced, and you can go to the original material and verify that the information that we have presented here is accurate and correct. We will open that up to all persons for review.
All right, I think Roland is at the end of his presentation, if I'm correct. And I want to thank you, Roland, for doing this today and all the great work that you're putting into Project Due Diligence. We actually got one question during the presentation today, and I'm going to ask you to field it. It asks, is there any possibility that the floors above the crash zone on both towers could have created a pile driver when the crash zone collapsed and destroyed the entirety of the building structure below them, or does that violate physical law?
Heat them. And there's no evidence that there was any fires on those floors. So what's causing those floor trusses to collapse? You have to have some mechanism.
And Roland, could you repeat that, please? Because there was some interference at the beginning of your statement. So if you could just reiterate what you just said.
Sure. If you're asking if the floor trusses above could have collapsed and caused a pile driver effect, which is the question as I understand it, there's no reason for those floor trusses on the floors above the impact zone to collapse because there were no fires on those floors. And you need some mechanism to make the floor trusses collapse. So first of all, the floor trusses couldn't have collapsed because they weren't exposed to any fires that would have caused them to collapse. So that knocks that question out, I think, fairly obviously right from the very beginning. I don't think it's worth examining a question of the impact that the floors could have if there's no way for the floors to have collapsed.
All right. Well, that was our question that we got during the presentation. So that is going to wrap it up for today. I want to thank everybody who tuned in for tuning in. Thank everybody who may be watching on the archives later. It will be available up on our YouTube channel. And again, thank you, Roland, for doing this presentation today. It's very informative, and I encourage everybody to share it far and wide. Let the people that you know, specifically if they're structural engineers, civil engineers, let them watch this and give their own 2 cents and hopefully be swayed by it and sign the petition at ae911truth.org. So have a great afternoon.
And